So now we'll look at implied depth, which is section 1.3 in your book. So this section is going to discuss suggested depth in two dimensions. So with three-dimensional objects and spaces like sculptures and architecture, we move around to get the full experience. But with two dimensional works like drawings and paintings, we see the entire surface all at once. So, how does an artist go about implying depth or representing three dimensional forms and spaces in two dimensions? Well, with the elements and principles of design by using smaller parts combined according to specific rules to make a whole. Artists can use value, space, and perspective to imply depth, and they can do this by evoking past visual experiences. So, for example, here we have Rene Magritte's Treachery of Images. And aside from the caption here, if anyone were to look at this, they would say that it is a pipe. But it's not a pipe. Rather, it's a painting in varying values that gives the appearance of depth and shadow. And so we recognize it as a pipe when in reality it is an illusion of a pipe. It is simply paint on canvas. Um, so modeling is a term that we use to describe the representation of three-dimensional objects in two dimensions so that they appear solid. And one way this is achieved is through the understanding of manipulating values. So value is the relative lightness or darkness of a plane or area. Light, or the lack thereof, affects how we see and perceive everything. Value can be thought of as a continuum, a spectrum, or a scale of light to dark that begins with white and moves through mid-gray to black. Value is how something appears depending on its relative lightness or darkness. Artists learn to mimic appearances by closely observing how light affects objects in real life. Relative dark values tend to increase as planes move away or turn away from a light source. And a value range is a series of different values, which can be subtle or gradual or not so much. Now, there are various methods of applying value to two-dimensional forms in order to create the illusion of three-dimensional space or forms. One of those methods is chiaroscuro. This is an Italian term that means light dark, and it's a technique that was developed by 15th century Italian Renaissance painters, and it refers to the balance of light and shade in a picture, especially representing the gradual transition from light to dark around a curved surface. Now, your book defines 5 distinct areas of light and shadow: highlight, light, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. And if you have ever taken a drawing class, or if you do ever take a drawing class, you'll get into sort of the specifics of the different types of shadows, but we won't do that here. Here is a figure study by Proudhon, where he is using chiaroscuro to render or model the female figure. Using a range of values or a range of lights and darks helps create the illusion of a figure, and really emphasizes the sort of roundness or three-dimensionality of the figure through this even gradation of value. Now, I will note here that value does not just apply to black and white, but we'll get to value with color when we get to section 1.4. Now, we also have Tenebrism, which is an extreme type of chiaroscuro, in which the dramatic use of intense darkness and lightness heightens visual or emotional impacts in a work, and it can also be used for emphasis. So we looked at Gentileschi's Judith beheading Holofernes previously and talked about communicative and directional line being used to create emphasis or to focus the viewer's attention on the moment of action here. But I also mentioned her use of contrast, contrast with the extreme dark background and then this extremely light kind of spotlighted foreground of figures here. So using Tenebrism to create contrast and emphasize the violent action and really create a scene that seems to emerge out of the darkness as it happens. Another method of expressing value, shading, or modeling is with hatching or cross-hatching. And this is especially used in media that demand thin lines or won't allow for much line width variation, or mediums that don't readily blend to create even gradients. So we'll see hatching and cross-hatching with pen and ink and in printmaking a lot. So hatching consists of series of lines that are placed close to and parallel to each other. Increasing the frequency of hatch lines implies darker values. The closer the lines are together, the darker the value appears. Cross-hatching is sort of a variant in which lines overlap or cross each other, and this intensifies the darkness of a value even more. So here we're seeing Michelangelo's head of a satyr. This is a pen and ink drawing, and the artist has used hatching and cross-hatching to model the face and imply solidity and depth. So really building up layers of hatch marks, overlapping in some areas, almost to the point of solid color, and really really creating shadows of the jawline and cheeks around the eye, and then using areas with no hatches to create highlights, sort of like on the cheekbone or on the profile of the nose and the forehead, suggesting that these areas sort of protrude out and catch more light than other areas of the face. Now, artists can also use space, or they must also consider space when they are trying to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane, because depth consists of both light and shadow as well as space. And there are various techniques of sort of implying three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional form. One is overlapping. So here we see a low relief or bas relief carving from the palace complex of Asurnarsupul, showing the king as well as some attendants and warriors on a lion hunt. So this is all done on the same level of low relief, but see how the figures have been overlapped to suggest that this one is in front of this one, or is closer to the viewer than this one, and that the king is closer to us than the man driving the chariot. We've also seen overlapping used in the Arapaxis altar relief, though here they are using overlapping as well as various actual depth of carving, and then the contrast of light and dark to sort of enhance that sense of depth. Here in Georges Seurat's Circus, he implies space and depth with overlapping figures, but also by differing the size and scale of objects within the work. So this is called relative size. Closer objects appear larger, while objects that are meant to be further away diminish in size and also pull the viewer's eye or attention into the implied space. Excuse me. And he also uses different positions within the picture plane to suggest depth and space. So, for example, figures or objects that are lower in the picture plane are closer to the viewer, whereas figures and objects higher in the picture plane are further away. We can also see the use of overlapping in Giotto's Virgin and Child. Um, For medieval Europe, painting was primarily a flat surface that was covered with shapes and colors, and really little attention was given to recreating depth or space from the natural world. So Giotto here is quite progressive with his implication of depth and space, um, which he creates through overlapping these forms to suggest these in the front are closer, whereas these in the back are further away. Another important thing to consider when trying to create or render three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional plane is how can an artist give the right impression of the object's height, width, depth, and position in relation to other objects when viewed from a particular point? Um, well, we do this through perspective. And there are various types of perspective and various combinations of techniques and elements that go into this. But we'll start with isometric perspective. So, in isometric perspective, all parallel lines are arranged diagonally within a work to give a sense of depth. The word isometric comes from a Greek word meaning equal measure. And so in isometric perspective, all lines continuously, all lines are continuously parallel and all axes or angles remain equal, which results in this continuous, non-distorted image. Now we're looking at a work by a Chinese artist, Zhu Yang. And Chinese artists have been using isometric perspective for well over 1,000 years. And because isometric perspective doesn't depend on a specific viewpoint, it's especially suitable for things like hand scrolls, which were popular amongst Chinese artists and still are, I suppose. But these are very long and can only be unrolled in sort of segments, so you can only view a particular portion of the entire scene at one time. So isometric perspective provides this sort of impersonal or mobile aerial view. So here the buildings along the canal have the illusion of depth, but not really as we would perceive it in reality. Because the lines remain parallel and the angles remain equal, all parts of the forms recede into space at an equal or uniform rate, which is, again, not as it would be in reality. Size of the forms does diminish slightly here to sort of reinforce a sense of spatial recession and depth, but not as they would in reality, again. Isometric perspective is often used in contemporary computer graphics for these same reasons, though. In things like The Sims or Minecraft, isometric perspective allows for this impersonal view, so the player kind of moves through the space as if they really were the character. Now, we also have linear perspective or one-point perspective, which is a system that uses lines to create illusion of depth in a two-dimensional work based on the observation of the natural world. And first, we had a sort of intuited version of linear perspective, and we can see that here in this work by Duccio. And Duccio he's applying the two main concepts of perspective. One is that objects appear to diminish in size as they get further away, and two is that parallel lines seem to converge on the horizon. Um, So Duccio is looking around, observing nature and the world around him, and then trying to replicate that. Excuse me. And so he is applying the idea that objects converge along parallel lines and diminish in space, or excuse me, diminish in size as they recede in space, but it's not quite right. Something's a little bit off. And so it wasn't until the 15th century that architect Filippo Brunelleschi codified the idea of linear perspective with mathematical formulas, and turned it into the technique we know today. So there are three components in all linear perspective: a horizon line, a vanishing point, and orthogonals. So the horizon line is the imaginary line that lies within a picture plane and mimics the horizon or the viewer's eye level. Orthogonal lines are imaginary parallel sight lines that can be traced from forms to the horizon line and suggest depth. A vanishing point is a point which is typically on the horizon line, at which all orthogonals converge. Now, there are variations of this system. You can have 1 point, 2 point, or multiple point perspective, but we'll start with 1 point perspective. And we'll look at Masaccio's Trinity from 1425 and 26. He was really one of the first artists to employ 1 point perspective, which 1 point perspective relies on the idea that the viewer will always view the work from a singular fixed point. And so here in this Trinity fresco, he's depicting the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and St. John in this faux architectural space. This is in the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, Italy. And Masaccio is attempting to create the illusion that the viewer is standing in front of an actual barrel vaulted niche in the wall here. And then below that niche is an altar table or a funerary sort of monument setup. And so he's considered where the average adult's eye line would fall, and that's where he's chosen to place his horizon line. And then he's given a central vanishing point here, and so all of the parallel lines, all of the orthogonals converge onto that vanishing point. Those that are above converge downwards, those that are below would converge upwards. Excuse me. And then the forms in the picture also recede or diminish according to this constant rate that the parallel lines converge towards. So Masaccio has created this monumental yet consistently scaled set of figures within a very reasonable or convincing architectural space. The figures are voluminous, modeled with light and shadow to look weighty, as if they actually take up space and have mass. And then also using the overlapping of forms to suggest progression through space as well. You can see here these figures, the Virgin Mary and St. John, are in front of these columns back here, but behind these here, as are Jesus and this figure of God here, whereas these two figures are in front of these arches and are closer to the viewer and therefore closer in space. This is another great example of linear 1 point perspective. This is Pietro Perugino's delivery of the keys to St. Peter from 1481. Now, this is a fictive space. There were no piazzas like this in Italy at the time, but a very great study in linear perspective. So we have these orthogonal lines that are marked out with the parallel lines of the tile flooring, and they seem to converge on one single vanishing point at the center of the temple there. And then this network of orthogonals and horizontal lines across the composition creates this grid that helps to measure space and figures and determine how the figures decrease in size through space. So it's physically kind of helping everything stay in scale. Now, we can also have two-point perspective, which simply put means that the rendering of an object requires two vanishing points and two sets of parallel orthogonals. So Masaccio's Trinity, as well as Pietro Perugino's delivery of the keys, they really rely on the fact that the viewer will be standing in a specific place, kind of directly in front of the composition. But what if they don't? Or what if the object in the composition doesn't line up with the orthogonals that converge on the vanishing point? Well, this is a problem that Raphael ran into when he was creating his School of Athens in 1510, 1511. This is a very large scale fresco in what were the Pope's apartments in Vatican City. And he's created a very grand sort of Renaissance style architectural setting for his Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and all of their sort of contemporaries to exist within. And really, he's exhibiting a masterful use of one point perspective. You can follow the sort of parallels or orthogonals along the space into a vanishing point that happens somewhere around the heads of these two central figures. The barrel vaulted spaces converge along those um, same angles, but excuse me. But if you notice, in the foreground, we have this figure who is leaned on this sort of cube. And that cube is not parallel to the picture plane. So it cannot abide by the same vanishing point like everything else, or it will look distorted. When a rectilinear object like a cube is positioned so that the corner is closer to the viewer rather than the side is, it requires two-point perspective, or it requires two vanishing points along a horizon to draw it. So here's an example. You can see the central vanishing point here, which the architecture conforms to and which the figures sort of diminish throughout space by. But with the cube, we have one vanishing point towards the left here, but another over towards the right. So it's actually depending on which set of parallel lines we're looking at here, it diminishes towards or converges towards two different vanishing points. So in reality, the composition as a whole has three vanishing points on this horizon. But the cube is the only object in the composition that responds to the left and the right vanishing points. Now we can also have multiple point perspective. Really, you can have as many vanishing points as there are sets and directions of parallel lines within a work. So here in Gustave Caillebout's Place de l'Europe on a rainy day, we have a series of multiple vanishing points that are sort of emanating from the various intersections on this street. The quality of the image here is not great, but you can sort of see how these parallel lines converge on various vanishing points and recede through the space and kind of pull the viewer down these streets and really add a sense of kind of energy, dynamism, or maybe even just a visual interest to the work. We can also have 3-point perspective, which is really the most common form of multi-point perspective. This is a work by M.C. Escher, Ascending and Descending, that utilizes 3-point perspective. And this is interesting because in this type of perspective, the vanishing point is no longer limited to the horizon. Rather, it can be moved above or below to sort of accommodate for a high, excuse me, a high or a low angle of observation. So either a bird's eye point of view or maybe a worm's eye point of view, as if you're looking up at or down on an object. And here are 1, 2, and 3-point perspectives put side by side so that you can sort of see the differences. The orthogonals have been colored with different lines in 2 and 3-point perspective, so you can sort of see how many sets there are. Now, for a pictorial space to be consistent, the logic of linear perspective really needs to be applied to everything that recedes into the distance. And this includes organic shapes, human and animal figures. And so we call this foreshortening. And you can really experience foreshortening if you look directly at your finger. It looks shorter. You know that it's probably 2 inches long, but really it's only taking up about half of an inch of your visual space. So it's distorted. Here is an example from Albert Dürer, who is a Northern Renaissance artist. This is a woodcut of a draftsman drawing a recumbent woman. And so this is a great example of how an artist might attempt to draw a organic form, a human body, from a sort of oblique angle, in which normal bodily proportions wouldn't really apply. So the artist is sort of positioned with this obelisk in front of him. And so he would line up his eye with the tip of that obelisk to ensure that his point of view stays consistent. And then he's viewing his subject through this gridded window, which will help him to sort of see the position or coordinates of the different body parts in relation to those grid lines, and then transfer them onto the corresponding grid on his paper. And this will sort of help him get the foreshortening correct, because it's tricky. You can't just use like a straight orthogonal line because it's an organic shape or form. Here's a good example of foreshortening. This is Andrea Montegna's Lamentation over the Dead Christ. So a lamentation is the grieving of Christ by Mary and John and his other followers after he has been removed from the cross. And so we have this really unusual perspective and quite radical foreshortening. Montegna really confines the image to this very tight, intimate space. We've got Mary and John weeping, grieving on this side. And then the body of Christ really recedes back into space quite dramatically. And it creates this illusion that the viewer stands directly at the feet of Christ. And really, the legs are almost over foreshortened. They are sort of truncated or chopped off, and his body seems to just grow as it recedes into space. But that does heighten the sort of dramatic effect here. It places an emphasis on the feet, and perhaps on the wounds, the stigmata, where the nails were driven through his feet. And these would be the closest thing to the viewer, but they've also been sort of purposefully diminished in size so that they don't block the body or any other views from the viewer. So we do have this sense of distortion. The feet seem too small for the rest of the body, and the recession of space, it doesn't seem quite right, but It's just exaggerated foreshortening. It does sort of serve to pull us into the scene, though, and kind of enhance that sense of intimacy. Maybe focus on the humanism within the scene as well. So once an artist perfects the techniques of perspective and foreshortening, they can start to perform tricks, sort of. Trompe l'oeil, Trompleoil, 2 words. It means trick of the eye. And so essentially, it's a style of painting or creating such a convincing illusion that the viewer is tricked into thinking that it's real. So, for example, ancient Romans would have painted the interiors of their homes and various buildings with these sort of intricate kind of faux architectural spaces. And so looking at the back wall here, we have this marble column that seems real. It seems like it is a part of the architecture. But looking at the side walls here, we can see that it's not. It's painted just like everything else, and it is actually a flat surface. Here's an even better example. This is Andrea Montegna again, and this is his camera picta. So this is a painted room. It was architecture that is built to be painted, not just a room that happens to have painting in it. And this is a royal bridal chamber. So it would have been used for the consummation of the royal marriage. And all around the walls, we have these very realistic or naturalistic portrait likenesses of different members of the royal family, um, kind of set within these scenes that are divided by the architectural pieces. Except everything you see here, architecture included, is painting. So we have a trompe l'oeil or a trick of the eye. Um, and this is all quite impressive, but what I really want to look at is the ceiling. So on the center of the domed ceiling, Montegna has um, depicted a marble and mosaic oculus. Sorry, a marble and mosaic oculus that opens up to this blue sky. And so we have this sort of decorative railing around the opening to prevent anyone from stumbling and falling in. And it's a good thing, too, because we have all of these figures leaning over to look down into the room. So this is sort of a joke that the artist is playing on the married couple. As if to say, look how talented and skillful I am. I can trick you into thinking that there are real people looking down on you on your wedding night. But he's utilizing 1 point perspective here. We have sort of the central vanishing point that everything seems to be converging towards, figures and architecture included. We also have foreshortening in the figures and the legs of these cherubs and sort of the features of these older individuals who are sort of leaned out, and the peacock as well. But a pretty impressive use of trompe l'oeil, as is Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. So this vast expanse of ceiling, Michelangelo used trompe l'oeil architecture to sort of divide it into smaller scenes and create some organization to the composition. Now, another type of perspective is atmospheric perspective. So artists will look at the effects of the atmosphere on the appearance of elements in the landscape. So this is a non-linear means of creating an illusion of depth. And it's created through changing color, value, detail, and clarity. So the quality of atmosphere, the level of haze, or maybe the relative humidity between us and larger objects such as mountains really changes the appearance of said objects. There are particles of moisture and dust and pollution that are suspended in the atmosphere and they scatter light. distant objects lack contrast and detail, and sharpness of focus and intensity of color, excuse me, because the atmosphere that surrounds them is not completely transparent. Cool colors tend to scatter light more, and blue scatters the most light. So the sky is blue or appears blue, and objects that are further away and therefore have more atmosphere between them and the viewer take on this sort of bluish tint. So closer objects are greater in clarity, they have more distinct outlines and brighter, warmer tones, whereas objects that are further away are hazy, they are less distinct, and lighter and cooler in tone. Um, Leonardo da Vinci was really the first European artist to apply this observation system in his Madonna of the Rocks here. He called it aerial perspective, but we call it atmospheric perspective. But his system is essentially what we use still today. Um, and so the foreground of the image here is really dominated by a sense of clarity and precision. We have this stark contrast between light and dark, as well as a masterful use of foreshortening. But if you notice, the distant mountains here, which we assume are the same color rock as these brown ones in the foreground, take on this very blue tone, and the sky starts to lighten as it reaches the horizon. Here is another great example. This is Dwelling in the Funchun Mountains by the 14th century Chinese artist Huang Gongwang. Um, Chinese and Japanese painters really relied on atmospheric perspective to suggest broad vistas of receding landscapes. So this is brush and black ink on paper, and the artist is really building up the masses of mountains with layers of contour strokes. And then we have trees that dot the slopes and houses kind of nestled within the hills. Notice that the trees diminish in size and grow fainter as they recede into the distance. And the furthest mountains are done really with just light washes of gray. So they're not as distinct, not as clear as those in the foreground. Here's another attributed to Li Cheng, A Solitary Temple Amid Clearing Peaks. So this one is a hanging scroll. The artist is employing atmospheric perspective. You can see how it's hazier in the background, but they're also manipulating sort of values and textures to create a sense of depth as well. And one more. This one is Asher B. Duran's Kindred Spirits. This work lives at Crystal Bridges, so if you ever manage to make it up there, keep an eye out for it. But here, Durand is using atmospheric perspective to really communicate the vastness of the American landscape and wilderness. So you can see the trees in the foreground are highly detailed, bright green, but as they recede behind the two figures, they become this sort of increasingly lighter gray, and they become less distinct, excuse me. And so the illusion of distance increases as the amount of atmosphere between the viewer and the object, the tree in this case, increases. And then we also have lighter colors in the center that sort of pull the eye through this illusion of infinite space back towards these hazy mountains. And that's all balanced quite dramatically with the brightly illuminated foreground details of the figures, the rocks, the trees, and the waterfalls. And this brings us to the end of 1.3. And so that wraps up our discussion today. We'll pick up with 1.4 color next time.